Good evening and welcome to a presentation by forester, musician, and award-winning author, Ethan Tapper. I am Lee Huss. I am president of the Indiana Forest Woodland Owners Association. For 37 years, I was honored to be the urban forester in Bloomington. During that time, I worked with passionate citizens, planners, support staff, politicians, civil engineers to create a forestry program that places trees as critical infrastructure in the design of a livable city. That same passion for trees in the natural landscape is evident within the members of the sponsor organizations of tonight's program. They are the Indiana Nature Conservancy in Indiana, Sam Shine Foundation, Let the Sunshine in Indiana, Indiana Society of American Foresters, the Indiana Associations of Consulting Foresters, and IFWO. Also at this time, I'd like to recognize that State Forester Jack Seifert and Hoosier National Forest Supervisor Mike Chavez are in the audience. Following Ethan's presentation, Chris Nigger with the Nature Conservancy of Indiana will moderate a discussion with a panel of local conservation experts. At the conclusion, Ethan will be available to sign your books in the adjacent meeting room. Several years ago, while on a fishing trip in Minnesota, former Indiana State Forester Bernie Fisher presented me a copy of Northern Woodlands magazine. This publication, written by and for Northeastern private woodland owners and nature enthusiasts, is where I was first introduced by the writings of Ethan Tapper. One article in particular that resonated with me and is also discussed in his book spoke of the ecological benefits of wolf trees. Being the owner of such a tree, a 200-year-old broken-limbed white oak growing near an historic survey cornerstone, it sadly represents the crown jewel on my previously high-graded forest property. Then, after reading Ethan's book, I was surprised to learn how it reminded me of my 9th grade science teacher's introduction to the class of Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. Like Leopold's seminary work about nature and the life of his Wisconsin cabin, Ethan's book is an account of his observations, thoughts, decisions, and ultimate efforts to use the tools of a professional forester and naturalist to regain his Bear Island forest, focusing not only on timber, but the long-term health, stability, and beauty of the entire natural community. It's good to know the land ethic is alive and well. Ladies and gentlemen, Ethan Tapper.
Hi. The lights go down. Goodness. What do you want to talk about? I have been in Indiana all of 36 hours. And the first question that I asked was, and so I've just told this to a couple people and their reaction has been really funny. So I want to ask you. The first question that I asked is, can I sample your local delicacies? So in Vermont, we have like maple syrup and apples and cheese and stuff. Do you know what they told me was Indiana's local delicacy? A pork tenderloin sandwich. Pounded flat and fried hard. And it's supposed to be this big, right? And the bun is like this big. I think I got it. I had one. It was really good. So my name's Ethan, and I'm mostly a forester from Vermont. And now a few other things. I'm privileged to be the author of this book that means a lot to me called How to Love a Forest. And since then, entering into this world of like digital storytelling, which is my attempt at a less gross way to say being an influencer, which is deeply strange. But ultimately, I would say that my life is sort of divided into this work of caring for ecosystems in Vermont, my own land, which I call Bear Island, and also the land of my clients. So I'm a consulting forester, I run my own company, and I have a lot of private landowners with forests of all different shapes and sizes that I help care for their forests as well. And then this work of communication, which is telling this story through writing and through social media and through speaking of how we care for these precious ecosystems. And I have to tell you that I did not plan to write a book. I did not plan to be up here in front of all of you. This is all something that sort of took me by surprise. And I do like to tell the story of how it happened because it's something that happened on accident in a way that has taught me a lot about how some really small things can become really big things. So when I started writing How to Love a Forest, I did not know how to write a book. I had never done anything like that before. And yet, there was some stuff that I wanted to talk about. And I figured out that there was this really special time of the day, the first hour that I was awake. And what I was doing with that first hour was I was like being really efficient on my computer and doing administrative work and just like firing off emails. And I said, what if I just took this hour all to myself? And I wrote. And so I started to, not to write a book, but just to write for an hour, for the first hour that I'm awake, which is, for me, is from 5 to 6 a.m. And it became this really beautiful practice, this wonderful way to start the day, where every day I'd just be drinking my coffee as the world was waking up and just writing from an hour. You know, tapping away at the laptop. 6 o'clock comes around, I close the laptop and go work in the woods. It was this practice that by itself, you know, these daily gestures, this hour of writing, by itself is completely meaningless. And then, you know, what it really felt like I was doing was taking a little stone and stepping off my back porch and throwing it back there. Gesture that's completely meaningless and insignificant, and then you do it again and again and again, day after day, and one day you look back there and you're like, that pile of stones is getting pretty big. I did this practice for 6 years, and then I signed this contract with a publisher, and I was like, this book's gonna be out by the end of the week. And they said, your publication date's in 2 years. So I worked on it for another couple of years, and that brought us to September of last year. Now, at the same time that this book was taking shape, one little gesture at a time, I was also engaged in a very similar parallel process, which is that I had become the owner of this forest that I named Bear Island. Now, in 2017, when I bought Bear Island, it was the most degraded forest I had ever seen, a forest that had every problem that a forest could have. And to me, it was really this symbol of like everything that was wrong with the world. And I didn't know how to bring this ecosystem back from collapse. It was too big to wrap my hands around. So what I could do was just offer it one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, to give to it the time and the resources and the energy that I had. And at the same time that I was watching this book that's called How to Love a Forest take shape, I was watching this forest of mine heal and seeing all of these different things, places that I once saw as being so hopeless, become these incredibly hopeful places. And really that forest going from being a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world in my eyes to being a symbol of what's possible and a symbol of hope. So the story that I really want to tell you all, what I want to talk about today and then talk about on this panel, is about this thing called stewardship. Have we heard of this word? Stewardship? It's an awesome word. And I think, you know, sometimes I get like so focused and so like in my little silo of thinking about forests and talking to other people that think about and talk about forests all the time, that I forget that maybe this isn't a word that we all use. It's a wonderful word. And the reason that it's so wonderful is that it's a word that encompasses this broad and endless and expansive process of caring, right? We can be stewards of each other. We can be stewards of our communities. We can be stewards of our families. And we can be stewards of our ecosystems. And it doesn't mean that we control them. And it doesn't mean that we dominate them. It means that we care for them, whatever that means, right? And there's another thing that I think is really special about this term, which is that sort of baked into it is this idea of a temporariness, right? That we are holding all of these things in this world, these lives, these ecosystems, these communities, on behalf of future generations. We're holding them just for this one brief and precious moment in time. And I think that a lot of times we get so focused in what we're doing right now that we forget that our job is to hand a world that is more abundant and more full of life and more full of opportunity to our children. And there's this amazing thing about caring for forests, which is that you get a little bit of an attitude with other people because you're like, oh, other people are doing all these other things, but I'm actually caring for these ecosystems that make it possible for us to live here, right? Do we know this? Sometimes I'll do like, in one of these talks, I'll be like, do you want to hear a forest fact? And then my forest fact is like, do you know that forests literally make it possible for us to exist on this planet and we can't live without them? Do you know that? There's a lot of things in this world that are optional, right? That we get to choose to support or not support, that we get to choose to care for or not care for, and ecosystems are not one of those things. Ecosystems are something that make our lives functional in an objective way, right? They create this climate that we inhabit and regulate it for us. They clean our air, they clean our water, they provide the pollinators of our food crops, and so many other things that it would be impossible to enumerate them now. And they also do this other thing, which is often forgotten as we think about how do we protect these forests that make our lives possible, which is that they make our lives beautiful. They make our lives worth living. They give us things like birds and trees, forests that we get to walk through. And an underappreciated part of that beauty that I really see in the future is going to be a bigger part of the incredible privilege that it is to be in this world with these forests is the beauty of getting to be a steward of these forests. That we get to go into these ecosystems which are so precious and so vital and so important in their own right, intrinsically valuable, that have the right to exist. And that also are in this moment are very wounded and struggling. And we get to help them move into a better future. And we get to help future generations see forests that are more full of life than we could possibly imagine. What a privilege. So when I talk about how to love a forest, I say a bunch of different things about it, but one thing I say about it is that it's a love story, because it's a story about how we actually discover what it means to love a forest in this moment, and how, like any great love story, the route that we use to get there might not be one that you'd expect. So I'm going to do a couple readings from the book, if that's okay with you. Here's the audience participation part. Is that okay with you? Okay. When I say read, you say, okay. So this is from the introduction of the book, which sort of describes what made me want to write it in the first place. Once it seemed that there were only two paths to follow. A status quo that saw forests and other ecosystems as commodities, and an opposing force that sought to protect ecosystems from ourselves, to leave them alone. As forests everywhere struggle under the weight of the many threats and the stressors of the modern world, as they suffer the legacies of the past and confront a future that promises challenges like never before, I have realized that neither of these two paths is enough. I have realized that the world needs action intertwined with compassion, relationship imbued with responsibility, death infused with life. I have gone my own way, fostering a divergent vision, a reimagining of what it means to love a forest, engaging in the radical act of trading simplicity for complexity, trading a tidy vision for one that is true. My journey toward these realizations has been long and lonely and sinuous. In my little house at the foot of the mountain, my bookshelf is crowded with books about trees and plants and animals, birds and bears and fungi, the relationship between people and ecosystems, and the threats both face. Never have I found a book that has articulated what a forest truly is, not just its botany and its biology, the contours of its many pieces and its parts, but how this entire living community moves and behaves and changes. Never have I found a book that described what it means to care for a forest like Bear Island, an ecosystem that has been changed and degraded and depleted and left to suffer alone. Never have I found a book that described the pain and the joy and the anxiety of trying to love and protect an ecosystem, of guiding it toward wholeness at this strange and crucial moment in time. No book has prepared me for the many complex and bittersweet choices that I would someday make at Bear Island, or for the fact that these actions would be celebrations, the substance of a truly radical and responsible relationship with the forest. In this book, I draw these disparate threads together, exploring what it means to love a forest in this changed and changing world. In a world that is both human and wild, both wounded and vibrant, both suppressed and emergent. This is a vision both for how we manage forests and take care of ecosystems, and how we manage ourselves, how we take care of each other. So I want to return to this last idea because it's another one that's really important to me. Because even as we have these ideas about this thing that we call nature and how we should take care of it, I think that's something that's fundamentally missing from the discourse of how we talk about it, is all of us here in this room right now. The objective fact that we actually really can't take care of ecosystems without acknowledging that we are a part of them. What did I find? We can't, without acknowledging that we are a part of them, that we affect them, and that our lives will always affect them. And also without acknowledging that in addition to wanting to have these ecosystems that are abundant and full of life and healthy and vibrant, we also want to have human communities that are abundant and full of life and vibrant. We want to live here. And sometimes we act like these questions of, how do we live here as humans, and how do we sustain this thing that we call nature are two different questions. And really, they're deeply connected, right? And so it's really important that as we're asking these questions about how we care for ecosystems, that we're understanding that we're a part of them too, and that we're making solutions that acknowledge that fact. So with that in mind, I want to go back and read one little thing that I skipped over. I was going to go flying again, I could tell. And it starts with this little mini reading starts with a vocabulary word. Do you like vocabulary? Yeah. I was yesterday speaking at the Crown Hill Cemetery. Have you been there? There's an amazing linden. It's a little leaf linden, not an American basswood, that's growing there. That is an incredible tree. You got to go and see it. And it grows. It broke and bent over like this, and then it healed itself and righted itself. It's amazing. The fruiting structure of a basswood or linden tree is called a cluster of nutlets subtended by a leafy bract. So now you know that one. Another one that I'm fond of is the structure that attaches a fir needle to the twig, which is called a suborbicular leaf cushion. You can use that in a conversation. Here's a vocab word for you. Forests are socio-ecological systems. Our lives are forever stitched into the green flesh of the biosphere. The separation of the human world from the wild world is an illusion. We cannot care for ecosystems without recognizing that we will always rely on them and we will always tax them. That human life will always be precious and worth nourishing and will always come at a cost. We cannot choose if we will impact ecosystems, if we will impact peoples across the globe, if we will impact the lives of future generations. We can only choose what that impact will be. What a responsibility and what an opportunity, right? So I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to tell a little bit about my story because I think it tracks with the bigger story that I want to tell you all. So I grew up in this little town in southeastern Vermont called Saxton's River. Have any of you heard of Saxton's River, Vermont? Really? This is unprecedented. I have asked that question. So I've done, since How to Love a Forest came out, which is 360 days ago, I have asked that question to audiences, I think 150 times. And this is the third time that no one has known about it, which is weird because Saxons River, Vermont is this teeny little town of 300 people. And it's surrounded by the forest. It's the perfect place, really, if you were going to start a story about someone who just always loved the woods and always knew they were going to work in the woods. And that wasn't my experience at all. Growing up in Saxons River, Vermont, I was surrounded by forests, and I had no idea that I wanted anything to do with them whatsoever. And it's funny because when I read these stories about these great nature writers and ecologists and biologists, they are always like, I was always the nature kid. I was always, down in the dirt looking at bugs, and I was tracking deer, and I was always out in the woods, and I always knew that this is what I wanted to do. And that wasn't my experience at all. What I remember feeling most strongly in those days was that I wanted to get out of there, really bad. And I remember telling someone my junior year of high school, I said, I don't know where I'm going to go to college, but I know where I'm not going to go. And that's the University of Vermont. Because everybody goes there, and it's like this huge cop-out. The first month of my senior year of high school, I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me that I got this scholarship called the Green and Gold Scholarship, which is a full scholarship. And I was like, guess I'm going to the University of Vermont. Fortunately, I had absolutely no values, no integrity. I said, okay. But even once I got there, I wasn't like magically knew what I wanted to do. I was like bumbling around taking these random classes, but it just happened that the first big love of my life, my high school girlfriend, as I was doing my second semester, she was on this wilderness expedition with this program for 5 months. And when she came back, she had this like huge life-changing experience. And I had not. I'd just been hanging out in my dorm room doing whatever 19-year-olds do. And we weren't connecting, and it was freaking me out because I thought we were going to break up. And so like any perfectly reasonable, rational 19-year-old, I said, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going on a wilderness expedition. And the next one with that program left in 2 weeks. And it was a 6-month expedition where we skied north for 3 months. And then we built a canoe and canoed back down. Now, in retrospect, I did this for no reason. The relationship did not work out. But after that, all I wanted to do was be in the woods. And I ended up working as a wilderness guide. I lived in this like uninsulated yurt with a fir bough floor in the woods of Maine for a year, worked with draft animals, did a little bit of draft horse logging. And then I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me that I had to come back or I was going to lose my scholarship. And I remember sitting on the bow floor of my yurt, holding a paper list of all the majors at the University of Vermont, and scrolling down, saw forestry, and I swear that I did not know what it was. I just saw the word forest, and I was like, let's try that. And it ended up being this really amazing fit. So I had this experience in this moment as I started going to forestry school, where I came to that experience of going to forestry school thinking that I already knew everything about forests and about what our relationship with them should be. I mean, I had been living in the woods for years in a very close way, and I thought that I understood these ecosystems completely, and I understood the perfect relationship that we should have with them, which was this very leave no trace, hands off attitude. I had, when I went to forestry school, this really jarring experience, which is that as I actually started to deepen my relationship with ecosystems and deepen my understanding of forests, I learned that these forests that I had thought were so perfect and so pristine and so utopian were actually deeply imperiled, that they were struggling with these profound legacies of the past, dealing with an incredible volume of threats and stressors in the present, the combination of things that we refer to as global change, and moving into a future that promised more challenges than ever before. And suddenly, I was walking through these forests, and it felt like something had been taken from me. Because suddenly, Yes, I still saw that these forests were beautiful, and I still saw that they were so, incredible, and they made me feel so much, but I also couldn't believe anymore that they were these perfect, pristine, utopian places that we could just say, just take our hands off them and everything's going to be fine. And it was a crisis for me in many ways, because what I had to do in that moment was to figure out what to do with that, right? Did I stop loving forests because suddenly they weren't what I thought they were? Or did I see where that love would take me, right? Did I ask myself, okay, so these forests are struggling. What do we do about it? There's two things that I think are really special about forestry in particular. One of these is that I think, as I started to go to forestry school, you take all these different classes, and you take soil science, and you take geology, and you take biology, and you study ornithology, and you study botany, and dendrology, and hydrology, and all of these different aspects of ecosystems. And as you're taking these individual classes, time and time again, I saw that all of these things were connected within forests, that actually you can't pull apart all of these pieces and create an ecosystem, that you actually have to bring them all together, that you can't have any one of these aspects of ecology without having all of them. And fundamentally, forestry is an attempt not to manage one single aspect of forest, but to manage all of that stuff at once. The forest itself, this incredibly dynamic and interconnected ecosystem. And I think that fundamentally is a better way to think about caring for ecosystems in that holistic way. And the second thing that I think is really special about forestry is that at its heart, it's a discipline of action. So imbued in us is this idea that we do not have to be bystanders in these ecosystems, that we can go into them and we can see what's going on, and then we can do something about it. As I learned more and more and more, I became more and more and more of an advocate for taking action, seeing what tools that we have to effect positive changes in these ecosystems. There's this concept, I don't know, maybe this is a Vermont thing, I don't know. Are you aware of the concept of a natural community? The concept of a natural community, it's a really cool idea in a bunch of different ways. Traditionally, as foresters, we would describe forests by what's called their cover type. So a cover type is like, a word or a description of a forest based on the trees that are there right now. So you go into a forest and there's a bunch of white pine trees and you're like, white pine forest. You go into a forest and there's a bunch of northern hardwood trees, it's a northern hardwood forest. You go into a forest with a bunch of hemlock trees and hardwood trees, it's a hemlock hardwood forest, right? Super, super simple. And it's really a very superficial way of looking at forests. Now, a definition that I like a lot more is this definition of what we call a natural community. And there's three reasons why I really like natural communities as a better definition of our ecosystems. One is that it is so much more expansive. So a definition for what a natural community is that I'm taking from this book called Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, which is a book about the natural communities of Vermont, is a natural community is, quote, and I'll tell you this twice. So if it goes over your head, I'm going to tell you again. A natural community is, quote, an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. Time number two. An interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. So what I like about this definition is it's so much more expansive. So a forest is not just these trees that are here in this moment. A forest is all of the living pieces and parts of this ecosystem. It's these trees, these plants, these animals, the birds, the bears, the butterflies, the fungi, all of these living pieces and parts. And it doesn't end there. It is also this physical environment, things like soils and waters, components of the forest that we traditionally think of as abiotic or non-living things like geology, where in the world that forest is. And it is also inclusive even of natural processes, the way that the forest changes over time. So forests if you didn't know, have fooled us all. They have fooled us into thinking that they are these ecosystems that are defined by being stable, by staying the same, when in fact they're these ecosystems that are defined by the way that they change. These natural processes, even things like the foundational and beautiful process of tree mortality, which is, by the way, as normal, as natural, as ancient, and arguably as essential to forest ecology as living trees, are as integral a part of them as the trees themselves. So, taking this definition, the thing that we call a forest is not just these trees. It is all of the living parts of this ecosystem, all of these non-living abiotic parts of this ecosystem, all of these natural processes. And what I like about this is not just having this as like a thought exercise. When we change what we call the forest, it changes what it means to take care of the forest. It is not our job to take care of these trees that are here in this moment. It's our job to take care of this entire volume of life. The best analogy that I can give you is that the way that I see a forest is it's like a coral reef. So the trees are like the coral. They're this living structure that defines this ecosystem around which this community is built. But none of us, of course, would ever say a forest, or a coral reef, I should say, is a bunch of coral in the water. We would define it by this dense and diverse web of life that's woven around that living structure. And that's what forests are like to me. So that's the first part of natural communities that I like. That's more expansive. The second part is that it has quality. So there's an idea that you can have a natural community that is a better or worse representation of that natural community. A white pine forest is not a white pine forest. There are so many variables that can determine what kind of a forest it is and its ability to sort of express how these different ecosystems have been on our landscape for thousands of years. And the third part of this natural community definition that I really like is that it has an element of potentiality. So what we're doing with these natural communities is we don't say, oh, here's a bunch of white pine trees in the forest, this is a white pine forest. We're looking beyond this moment. And we're asking ourselves, what has this place been in the past? What could it be in the future, all other things aside, that may sort of derail its journey toward its future self? So deer overpopulation and introduced plant species, introduced pests and pathogens, and climate change, and all of these other things. We'll put those over here and say sort of like, what has this forest been and where is it going? And so this is an incredibly profound gesture because it allows us to look at these forests as they are today and to realize that actually a lot of our forests are far more and far different than they appear. That a forest that we might see here in Indiana, that's a bunch of, Virginia pines, might actually be a savanna, right? It might actually be this place that has been providing this incredibly rich and beautiful habitat for thousands of different species of organisms for thousands of years. And it is only in this state for this moment in time. And what I love about this is that it helps us think about these ecosystems, which again are not just these trees, but this entire volume of life in a way that we're saying, how do we help this forest not become what we want it to be, but to become itself? So as we compare these sort of elements of this natural community to the thing that I mentioned at the beginning, this idea of a cover type. There's a bunch of pine trees here, this is a pine forest, versus this incredibly dynamic natural community, which is all these living things, these non-living things, natural processes, this thing that has quality, and this thing that also has an identity, which is not linked to where it is right at this moment in time. It feels like when we talk about natural communities, we're talking about a forest's face. When we talk about cover types, we're talking about a forest's face. And when we talk about natural communities, we're describing like its soul. That's what it really is. And I mention all of this because there's this amazing thing that happens with ecosystem stewardship, which is that if we take the time and we ask the questions and we engage with the people who have done this work, we have the opportunity to deepen our understanding of these ecosystems and to deepen our ability to care for them. an understanding of what it means to be a good steward of an ecosystem in this moment. It's not something that any of us are born with. It's not something that is easy to understand. It may be something that's powerfully counterintuitive, as I often describe in How to Love a Forest. It may be something that is even heartbreaking or jarring or confusing, right? How could it be that we could be cutting a tree, a beautiful tree that we love, and it could be part of how we care for a beautiful ecosystem that we love? It doesn't make any sense, and yet it can be a way that we help these ecosystems heal. So I just have 12 more minutes, 10 more minutes. And so I want to tell you a story, and then I want to do one last reading. I'm not going to finish in time, and I'm just going to do it anyway. There's nothing you can do about it, because I'm up here. So I want to tell you the story of my land, which is called Bear Island, as a means to sort of talk about this a little bit more deeply. So when I first heard about this land that now I know as Bear Island, I had this idea that, I was helping all these other people as a consulting forester and then as a service forester, public forester, helping all these other people care for their forests. And I was like, someday I would like to have a forest of my own to be the steward of. And my friend was like, did you see that big piece of land for sale? 175 acres. And I looked on this realtor's website, and it said 175 acres for sale. And almost as an afterthought, what they really wanted to focus on with this ad was this view of this mountain called Camel's Hump, which, where I live, a view of Camel's Hump is like the currency of wherever you live. It's like, you gotta have it, it's all that matters. Everybody wants a view of Camel's Hump. And so the ad was almost like, don't worry about that 175 acres, just build your mansion right here, and you can look at Camel's Hump. It was pretty cheap, and I was like, what's wrong with it? And I went to go take a look. So the first thing that I saw when I rolled up onto this piece of land was that I went up on the access road, and it hadn't been properly stabilized, and there was a ravine cutting right down the center. I had to straddle it with the wheels of my truck. I finally got up to this clearing, this log landing, which is where that picture of Camel's Hump had been taken from, and it was covered in trash. Bags of household trash, hydraulic hoses and cables and buckets and tires, and busted pieces of equipment half buried in the ground. And going out from it in every direction, this network of skidder trails, logging trails, with these 3-foot deep ruts just bleeding murky water down the mountain. It was not a great way to start. And I said, you know what, I'm here, I'll go take a walk. And so I started to walk up the main trail, and it was incredibly steep. It was getting covered in sweat, covered in ticks. And as I was walking, I was getting like a funny feeling. Something was wrong, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And after about an hour, I was thinking about it, and I realized that what was bothering me was that there were no healthy trees in this forest, which is weird because I've never seen a forest before that doesn't have any healthy trees. And I started looking around. I was like, no healthy trees, no healthy trees, no healthy trees, couldn't find them. So what I now know happened is that the previous landowner had just told these loggers, go cut every tree on the mountain that's bigger than 10 inches in diameter, which is like pretty small. And they had done it. This is a practice that we call diameter limit cutting. Really what it was this unethical practice we refer to as high grading, which is where you go into the forest and you cut all of the most valuable high-grade trees, and you leave the least valuable low-grade trees behind. And what it was basically the inverse of what any responsible forest steward or forester or logger would ever do. You're managing the forest very efficiently to be less healthy. And I think there's an argument to be made that it would have been a greater kindness to this forest if they had just cut all the trees, because then at least there would have been enough light and enough space to regenerate a new generation of trees that would have had a chance to be healthy. But as it was just kind of stuck. So I kept on walking, and I saw that even in places where there was enough light and there was enough space that was created to regenerate some trees, that all of those young trees were getting browsed to death by white-tailed deer. There was deer overpopulation here, as there is almost across this entire continent, which is a major threat to our biodiversity. I slid down over these cliffs that bisect the land from west to east and right into a 30-acre infestation of an introduced plant called Japanese barberry. Have you heard of it? Waist high, pure. 30 acres, no native plants. And I pushed through that patch of barberry and got up back to my truck, and I said, forget this place. I am out of here. I will find a forest somewhere else that's easier to love. And I left. And sure enough, I didn't want to think about it, but I would check on it from time to time, and it was still up on that website. And I started to ask myself if this forest was actually hopeless or if there was something that I could do to help. And 2 months later, I convinced myself to go back. And when I went back, it was summer, and I started finding all this cool stuff. So I started finding that there were these plants that I love, like sweet fern and low bush blueberry and pink corydalis and red columbine. Started finding that there were actually some healthy trees there after all that were just so hidden by all these masses of unhealthy trees that I hadn't seen them. And that there were these rock outcrops covered in reindeer moss with these sweeping views of the Winooski River Valley. And I was standing on one of those rock outcrops when I said to myself, I'm going to try and buy this place. Didn't know how to do that. Never did anything like that before. And so I called up my old boss, Mike, who sold forest land real estate. And I said, Mike, there's this piece of land and I want to make an offer. And how do I do this? How do I make an offer? How much should I offer? And he said, well, let me ask you a few questions. Is there any timber on it? And I said, no. And he said, any real estate potential? No. Is the access good? No. Could it be a sugar bush? No. And he just kept on asking me these questions, kept on answering no, 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 no. And eventually he said, well, Ethan, this place sounds terrible. Just offer them like nothing, and don't be afraid of hurting their feelings. And that's how I became the owner of this piece of land. And I tell you what, it's one thing to believe that all we got to do to take care of these ecosystems, to take care of this thing we call nature, is to leave it alone. And it's quite another thing when you're standing on that log landing that is suddenly no one's responsibility but yours. In a forest with no healthy trees, 30-acre area that's doomed to be infested by Japanese barberry and nothing else forever, a deer overpopulation, a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, a mass extinction, watching thousands of years of soil roll down the mountain through those skidder ruts. And I had to ask myself in that moment if it would be a greater kindness to leave that forest alone and to hope for the best, or to do absolutely everything in my power to try and make it healthy again. Now, you may not know this, but we are all standing on that log landing right now. And we have this fundamental choice, which is to recognize where we are and these ecosystems that we are the stewards of, whether we like it or not, and this responsibility that we have to care for them as best we can with the tools that we have. We can choose to do that, or we can choose to do nothing. And in my case, I chose to take action. And in this effort, I have to tell you that I have two superpowers. Superpower number one is ADHD, which used correctly can be extremely powerful. And superpower number two is that I am not a purist. And so I could ask myself radically, what tools do we have to help fix these problems and help put this ecosystem on a better path for a better future? I wish that I could tell you that all that I had to do was just fill my pockets with wildflower seeds and just go across the mountain scattering them like this. I would have done that. I would have loved that. But that's not what this forest needed from me. And instead, what my stewardship looked like was cutting thousands of trees, finding every healthy tree that remained, and giving it a bit more room to grow by cutting less healthy trees that were competing with it. And in areas where there were no healthy trees at all, cutting areas of trees to regenerate a new generation that had a chance to be healthy. I had to teach myself to run an excavator so that I could restore those old eroding skid trails and build new, more resilient trails. Teach myself to be a deer hunter so I could lower that population of white-tailed deer that is such an existential threat to our biodiversity. There is a particular parity in one element of this restoration that I want to tell you about, which is that I know that 30 years ago, these loggers came to my forest, and they used these tools. They used these skidders, these pieces of logging equipment, particularly these cable skidders, because they have a cable winch on the back, made by this company Timberjack in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and these chainsaws. And they created all of these problems that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to fix. And as I heal this forest, two of my most powerful tools are my 1981 Timberjack cable skidder, his name is Red, and my chainsaw. There are so many things like this that, if we are not purists, yes, can be used to harm and degrade ecosystems, and used in a different way can help them heal. And there's another thing that's like that, which is us. There is no doubt that we are the greatest threat to ecosystems. There is no doubt that we have caused all of the problems that they face, and I believe that there's no doubt that we are their best hope for a better future, that we have an opportunity to actually become keystone species in these ecosystems, to be a force for good. And so I don't really have time. How much time do I got?
2-3 minutes.
Perfect. I'm going to do a 5-minute reading. So I'm not going to say anything else about it, but thanks for listening. And if you have questions, we're going to have a panel with myself and some people who are much smarter than me in a moment. But I want to do a reading from the end of the book about what an incredible opportunity I think that this moment that we're in is. It's a longer reading, so sorry about that. The storm clouds stamp their feet. They are corralled along the shifting path of the big river, thundering between the walls of the valley. The clouds move west, driven like cattle toward the mountains. As empty as it often feels, there is something beautiful about a life lived in the aftermath. Here, in the junkyard of the Anthropocene, we hold the fate of the world, all of its ecosystems, all of its peoples, in our hands. In this moment, we can allow this biosphere, our home, to sink further into dysfunction and disarray, or we can make the radical and bittersweet decisions necessary to choose a different path. Inside of this catalyzing moment, we have the opportunity to reimagine our relationship to ecosystems and our relationship to each other, to redefine what we are and what is precious to us. As empty as they often feel, there is something beautiful about a landscape of forests that are just a fraction of their true potential. The forests of our lives are still only at the beginning of their journeys. They may yet become diverse and complex, rich with legacies, ancient again. With our help, these forests may rediscover a capacity for life beyond imagining, an abundance that this world has not known for generations. I pick up another acorn, another product of thousands of years of adaptation and change, another precious thing chained to the legacies of the past and hurtling toward an uncertain future. Perhaps it is doomed. Perhaps it contains endless possibilities. Humidity cloaks the land, drawing tiny round beads of sweat from my skin. For a moment, the mountain is cast in golden light. It smells sharp and strong. As I touch another acorn, a raindrop strikes the back of my hand, rolling between the small bones of my fingers. Suddenly, droplets are stippling the soil like falling stars, throwing up little clouds of dust. I have nowhere to be, and so I kneel, watching the water run around the stumps and the upturned leaves, drawing spider webs on the earth. Someday I will tell my children that the caves in the talus above are a womb, the origin of all the black bears on the mountain, and that the springs in the big bowl are the source of all of its waters. Someday I will walk these trails with my children and teach them to reimagine forests as communities of complexity and depth and expansiveness, communities that are fated to change, to celebrate both the miracle of life and the miracle of death. Someday I will kneel beside these stumps, a young forest blooming around me, and teach my children the imperfect truth of what it means to love a forest. Someday I will teach my children that this world is not ours to hold, but that we hold it anyway. That each of us is a steward for one brief and precious moment in time. In our short lives, we must learn to pair power and freedom with humility, to embody relationship and responsibility, even when it breaks our hearts. Someday I will teach my children that despite everything, we are destined to thrive, that we are destined to live in a world that is beautiful. In the years to come, the traces of this moment will fade. This empty patch cut will have become a diverse young forest, the stumps softening and mixing with those of the oaks cut decades ago. I will walk through this young forest and remember this autumn day when my hands were young. I will remember that each tall, perfect oak was once an acorn between my fingertips, that this forest is a child of responsibility, something that we could only have embodied together. No one but me will ever truly know the pieces of myself that I've left on this mountain, the labor of love that being the steward of this land has been. I will know, and that is enough. We owe too much to the future to be imprisoned by the past. As the storm passes over me, I am grateful to be anything at all, grateful to be alive at a time when there is so much worth saving. I want to live in the world that will arise from this moment, the world built by people who are brave and humble and resilient, who make countless bittersweet compromises, who live their lives with the dream of a better world burning in their chests. I want to live in a world that will be created by people planting acorns in the rain. Sometimes this life feels like autumn, the exhausted end of a boundless summer. Today I choose to live in a world in which spring is just breaking, a world that is just awakening, just beginning to discover what it truly is. I look toward the broken ridge of the mountain and feel a powerful nostalgia, not for the past, but for the future. High above the storm, the light is swelling, calling everything upward toward a world that is just beginning. Thank you. So we're now going to invite the other panelists to the stage to answer your questions. Thank you. Thanks.
You're a poet.
You really are.
That's great. I can confirm that you speak English and also write pretty well in it. So
Yeah, what a lie.
Yeah, a little.
My grandfather-in-law grew up in Delos Falls, so
Oh, really?
yeah, like right in your neck of the woods.
They might need some water.
Oh, that'd be great. If there were extra waters, I'd love it.
There's water.
The lights are rough. Or he's stressed.
He's the English professor.
So first of all, thank you, Ethan, for the time you gave us and the messages you shared. My name is Chris Naggers. I am the Director of Forest Conservation for the Indiana Chapter of Nature Conservancy. But I'm up here tonight to moderate a panel discussion with a bunch of people that I admire and respect very much. So for this portion, we invite members of the audience with questions to make their way along stage left to the mic stand up here, ask your question for the panel, see what they have to say. After you've had your question answered, make your way out and around and back to your seat. So, are we ready?
Yeah.
Thank you. Apparently, the audience participation part didn't present.
Chris, would you like to introduce ourselves first? Who we are?
Yes. Alan asked me to moderate this panel. I immediately said yes. I hung up the phone like a day later and went, I don't exactly know how to do this. But I'm going to stand away from your mics.
Smart.
And if we could go from, no, Ed, you don't want to go first?
I can, I guess.
Well, too bad. You're going first.
Okay.
We'll see.
I'm Edward Ullman. I'm here on behalf of the Indiana chapter of Society of American Foresters. I'm the chair of the Indiana chapter of Society of American Foresters. Similar to Chris, I was voluntold to be on the panel, and I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. And then about the minute after I hit send on that email, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. So that is me.
Hi, I'm Brian Stone, and I'm here representing Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. I serve as the Indiana chapter chair for that organization. I also serve as the outreach coordinator for the Turn In a Poacher program with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. For my day job, I'm probably the odd one out here and don't know what I'm doing. I'm an English professor at Indiana State University. I have an interest in researching the early conservation movement and the role that literature and art played in shaping that.
I'm Dan Borrett. I am with the Indiana Wildlife Federation, and we are a statewide advocacy group that promotes all things wildlife, and forests play a big role in wildlife.
Thank you. I'm Alan Purcell. I work for the Sam Shine Foundation, and I realize it doesn't tell you anything. Sam Shine was a wealthy industrialist who loved conservation and during his lifetime protected thousands of acres and left an endowment that was very substantial and wanted to see his wishes carried on. And so the foundation I work for only gives money and support to conservation organizations.
Thank you all very much. Hopefully with that, we have some more questions lined up. So again, make your way down to the mic stand next to Liz here. And then make your way on and around. Would you like me to get started with one that I queued up?
We got someone coming.
All right.
Maybe not.
So, of all the species that have been lost and displaced over the past several centuries, in your opinion, which was the greatest agent of change that is no longer in our forest ecosystems?
What a great question. Can I answer so Vermont's different than Indiana. Two of them that I write about in the book that I am very interested in, one of which is the beaver, which is an amazing species. Shout out to, if you want to feel like, read a book about how beavers are just going to save the world and solve all of our problems, read the book Eager by Ben Goldfarb. There's another book that I'm reading right now, actually, that's an interesting sort of cultural history of beavers and beaver trapping, which is called Beaverland, which is by a fellow Vermont author. In Vermont, we have this incredible history where we think that we had these valleys that were incredibly shaped by beavers for thousands of years. We think that we had about 300 beaver dams per square mile in our valleys, which a square mile is 640 acres. Beaver dam every 2 acres. And beavers were, an influence on our landscape hydrologically. They provide what we call a keystone species, right? They provide habitat for all of these other species. They build soils, they store carbon, they, provide flood resilience and all of these other things, water quality improvements. And they're this really cool species. Obviously, we have beavers here again, largely due to these restoration efforts and reintroduction efforts. But probably not at the level that they were present historically. The other one that I talk about in the book is the passenger pigeon, which we know we had here. I think there's some debate about exactly their role on the landscape, but historical accounts point to them existing on our landscape in these mega flocks of billions of birds. And John James Audubon points to them. He talks about in his writings about riding through this like beautiful forest of like big oaks and stuff. And then the next time he came after the passenger pigeons had made choice of this place, there were trees that were 2 foot in diameter, broken off. The understory was smothered in inches of their guano. And they were just their sheer mass of a passenger pigeon megaflock landing in an area, nesting in an area, could cause a tremendous amount of change on the landscape. That's the other one I think about.
Yeah, there's actually an account of passenger pigeons. This is the one I thought of, too. There's an account of passenger pigeons by an early traveler on the Buffalo Trace between the Falls of the Ohio and Sins. And he records this very thing. He says there was an area that he crossed approximately 50 acres in size, that the timber had been utterly destroyed by the passenger pigeons, that they, by their sheer mass, had broken trees in half, and that the pigeon dung, as he put it, was 12 to 18 inches deep. So that is difficult to imagine. But these were stand replacing events. They were taking stands of timber and destroying them, not by just breaking the tree down, but they put so much ammonia and nitrate on the ground that it essentially killed any other plant that was there, and the whole system had to start over.
It's amazing when you really start to talk about forests, you start to kind of like to re-understand the role of like tree mortality and disturbance in these ecosystems as not something that's like would visit them and is this like huge tragedy, but something like even what is being described with these passenger pigeons, you're like, wow, what habitat would that have created? You know, what opportunities would that have created? And time again, we see that like tree mortality, natural disturbances in these ecosystems are actually like these incredibly important and life-giving parts of what it means to be a forest and what it means to be an ecosystem on this landscape and places that have created habitat for thousands of different species of organisms.
And I would jump in on that too, just thinking of agent of change kind of in a different way. Once the passenger pigeon was extinct, there was public outcry about it, and a lot of people were upset. So you read the newspaper accounts, was it Martha, the last passenger pigeon that died in captivity? And the effect that had on the American public really woke them up to what was going on and to the fact that there needed to be changes made. Yeah.
And they helped build Chicago. One reason passenger pigeons were decimated to the degree they were in Indiana was we needed to feed the people in Chicago, and they were the cheapest source of protein the world's ever seen. So, but they were, I mean, the two best answers, in my opinion, have been said: beavers and passenger pigeons. I mean, icon, transformational species that literally shape landscapes.
Agreed.
Ethan talked about the forest being a developing ecosystem and dynamic and changing over time. We have a lot of change going on now, both with animals and with plants. There are armadillos in Missouri now, there are iguanas in Florida, and there are plants that are now in this part of the country that never used to be because of climate change. How do we know what's supposed to be joining our forests and what we have to get rid of?
That, I'm going to jump in and start off on this one. I feel like that is a loaded question that has challenged foresters and ecologists for years, and it's something that we were talking about diving into old texts and stuff. We have literature going back to original surveys when we were first settling, central hardwoods, that we look into, and it gives you an idea, but it's a very different forest than what we walk in today. And there's also a lot of change, as you talk about. You mentioned armadillos in Missouri, but we got armadillos in Indiana, so they're showing up here too. And I think one of those is trying to draw that line on what was there and what was in the past and what's there today, and the encroachment, but also acknowledging what encroachment can be balanced through natural processes and what encroachment isn't, natural or native. You know, obviously we can rule out the invasive plants and things like that, but, you know, with ecological changes and stuff, we're seeing warmer climate plants are moving further north. We're seeing cooler climate plants moving out of our ecosystems, and being able to acknowledge that change is happening, but taking accounts of what was naturally here, what was naturally in the surrounding native landscapes years ago, 100 years ago, and as we move that out and try and encourage those native communities to still be here while still treating and removing the non-native encroachment.
There's, I think that we often think about that, so we use these terms like there are species that are native, there are species that are non-native, there are species that are invasive. I think it is important to understand that when we say that we really want these native species, and we don't want these non-native species or these non-native invasive species, it's not a value judgment, right? So what we're recognizing with these native species is that these are the species that have been here for thousands of years. And so when we say oh, it's a native species, it's probably okay, or oh, it's a non-native species, maybe it's not okay. What we're really saying is that we know that these ecosystems are like these really complex and intricate cultures of all of these different organisms that have these co-evolved relationships with each other. You know, they've been engaged in this process for millennia. And these species that were not part of this process, what we call the non-native species, don't have that complex web of relationships. And so that does two things. One thing that it does is it doesn't provide habitat for all of those other native species that have complex relationships with the native species, right? So we're, you know, in some ways when we have these non-native plants in our garden, there's this whole movement to plant native, and that's about not planting species that are invasive and can become problematic, but also just about providing more good opportunities for our native species. We have these pollinators, we have these insects, we have these other organisms that have very complex relationships with plants, right? And let's give them some more habitat rather than putting these non-native plants that they don't have a relationship with on the landscape. And then the other part of it is not putting in species that are what we call invasive, which is a subjective assessment. We have a lot of non-native plants that are not invasive. They are not problematic for our biodiversity. They are not displacing native species. And so while it could be better, if they were a native species, they could be providing more habitat, they're also not problematic. And then we have just a few, really by comparison, of these plants that are like sort of like a wolf in the hen house, right? Where they're just, our species have no ability to compete with them. They never would have had to evolve an ability to compete with them because they haven't been exposed to them in their entire evolutionary history. And so in these ecosystems, something that we can do to help them out is to remove these invasive plants that are, you know, fundamentally haven't been here, were just introduced by people, and displace our native species that are so important for so many different things, and also just like have the right to be here, as they have been for thousands of years.
Yeah, I think everything they've said is absolutely right. I think one other interesting thing to think about is, as we discussed, beavers and passenger pigeons are transformational species on the landscape. They're no longer here, right? So things have changed in our landscape. Disruptions have changed. Something I think you see, and I may be the least qualified person on the stage to talk about this because I'm not a forester, but we live in a world now where some of our longer lived, more important tree species, aren't thriving because they're being outcompeted in succession, right? So you can think about where we are right here. You go outside, if you were to clear cut everything, you know what's not gonna be the first thing to come and dominate are oaks. Oaks are vital for wildlife, which is the angle I'm coming at that with. You're gonna be outcompeted by sassafras, sycamores, so on and so forth, right? So we also have to manage our native species, which are good to give these other species the opportunity to thrive, because in the world we have given them by exterminating passenger pigeons and almost exterminating things like beavers, that dynamic of change has been disrupted. So we have to act as disruptors as you were saying, to manage our landscapes. We have to fill the role that we have destroyed, in essence.
I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Can I just add one other thing? Because the other element to your question, of course, is asking this question about like assisted migration. So the assisted migration, right, is where we're recognizing that our climate is changing faster than our species ranges can shift. So we're talking about like these species as they came back following like glacial retreat. We're talking about historically they might have moved like 1 to 2 miles per century. And now they're having these climates that are moving orders of magnitude more quickly. And so this other question that we're asking is like, how do we help forests, expand the ranges of some of these tree species such that we can have trees that are well suited to this climate as it changes really quickly? That process of deciding which species to do that with and how to move them and how far to move them is something that really smart researchers are figuring it out. For the most part, we're not like plucking tree species from Florida and planting them in Indiana. Mostly what we're doing is this process that we call assisted range expansion, which is where we're taking species that are already here, but at the northern end of their range, and through management and also to a certain extent probably through planting, to help them expand their range further north so they can respond to those changes.
Well, I'm glad that question was before mine because it leads into mine. I am a very new non-scientist owner of a small parcel of forest. Thank you. And my question has to do with triage. It's a young forest just out in Brown County here close, and it can be really overwhelming to look out and see the burning bush and see the multiflora rose and see the honeysuckle. And then that's just the first layer, right? Because then you start worrying about exactly what you just mentioned about the types of trees that are here and what trees do. And it's two of us and neither of us know what we're doing. So, my question really is just where do we put our energies first?
Burning bush.
Asked and answered.
It's overwhelming, right? But I guess the first thing is don't get overwhelmed, right? It is a process. You're going to have successes and failures and everything rolled into one. But focus on the things that are doable, right? Burning bush is really easy to pull out. That is maybe the one good thing about it is it's so shallowly rooted. But get rid of the things to the degree you can that you know are the most prolific at reproducing, right? Because if you don't get rid of them, they're just going to continue to go. And don't be afraid. I think you mentioned not being a purist. I think this may elicit some negative responses, but I'm pretty comfortable with it. Don't be afraid of herbicide. It's necessary, right? It is necessary in a invaded environment to have real success. So use all the tools available to you and focus on those things that are the most aggressive.
I'm going to approach this from an analogy on a completely different plane. I got a 1-year-old at home. She's turning 1 tomorrow. And there's plenty of opportunities for my wife and I to sit there and be like, this is a lot of work. And plenty of opportunities for us to be like, what, was this a good decision? Do we want another one? Where are we at in this stress level world? But also, all it takes is for that one moment where she hears a little song on a commercial and starts dancing, or says a word or something to make you, stress disappears. And I think that taking time to not be so focused on the work that's necessary on the property, taking that walk through the property and finding those mosses, or, when springtime comes, go out there with a wildflower book and find those wildflowers and stuff, and take time to find those little wins in places. And as you continue to do this work, whether it's invasives, whether it's timber stand improvement, whatever the tasks at hand are going to be, and you're going to see those little wins compound more and more, and those appreciations. And maybe it's journaling them down and writing them and using them as the the backing that you need to help continue the positive work, but it's easy to look at the mountain ahead of us that we have to climb, but we don't stop and turn around and be like, wow, look at the view that we've already crossed. And I see that so often in forestry. You've got 2 acres of straight invasives in front of you, or whatever, stilt grass, and it's like, I could bale this and sell it for, horse feed, but or turn around and be like, oh look, there's this one little wildflower here that's really pretty. So taking the chance to acknowledge the wins. But
I think that a lot of us, so when I was, especially when I worked for the state of Vermont, part of this conservation community that was the, state agencies and these nonprofits, and our big struggle was always like, how do we get the people to come to our events and to read our resources and to watch our stuff and to come, engage with us, sign up for our email list, volunteer with us, and so what I often tell people when they're asking for how do I get this help, I would tell you that those organizations have been waiting to hear from you. And a lot of them are just in this room, right over here, and they have resources for you, and they have mentorship for you, and they have walks for you, and they have ways to pair you up with different experts, and avail yourself of those opportunities. We're just so blessed to have these land trusts and these conservation organizations, and landowner organizations that provide so many amazing things. So I would say that's avail yourself of that as well.
I guess my question is more of about advocacy, and I think that a lot of our forests, especially in this region, are endangered by very well-meaning people who love the forest and want to care for it and don't know how. And I guess, how do we get the message of people in the forestry community, or people who are really into this, that loving a forest is more than leaving it alone? I think that this is it comes in a lot on our public lands here. I think a lot of the people who work on our public lands are constantly beleaguered by people who think they're doing the right thing, as well as we have a lot of landowners in the area who maybe have 2 to 5 acres, maybe 10 acres at a large scale, who are very afraid to touch it. They don't know what they're doing. The idea of going in there with a chainsaw sounds terrifying to them. How do we expand this message beyond this room to people who need to hear it?
It's a great question. So one thing I would say is that I think one thing that is very important for us to understand is that our job as people who care about forests is not to figure out the one way to take care of them correctly and then to just apply it everywhere. That actually there's a diversity, in addition to wanting to cultivate a diversity of different tree species and a diversity of different sizes and ages of trees and a diversity of different types of forests across the landscape and ages of forests across the landscape as a means to cultivate forest resilience, resilience in a changing climate. This is what we call risk spreading. It allows us to not just create habitat for lots of different critters that utilize these different things, different tree species, different structural conditions, different forest ages and types and expressions, but also to do risk spreading, not to put all our eggs in one basket, so that we're not vulnerable to an uncertain future, right? And another type of diversity that is often overlooked is a diversity of different approaches, right? The fact that we actually want to do a lot of different things. And so one thing that's interesting is, I feel like a lot of times, in a lot of different communities, certainly in the conservation community, we can be like this parable that I'm now going to butcher about the blind men describing what an elephant is. Do you remember this one? Where there's the one blind man and he's touching the elephant's leg and he's like, an elephant's like a tree trunk. And another one's touching its tusk and it's like, oh, an elephant is like a rope, right? There are a lot of people out there who have figured out that there's something good about managing forests, and there's something good about not managing forests, and they're both right. But both of those are just describing one piece of what we need to do, right? So it's not even that we need to necessarily, all of us, like change our minds about these things. We just need to zoom out and go a little deeper and understand what we're really trying to do here, which is to fundamentally create a landscape that is functional and vibrant and that also supports us in our communities as well. For me, that's the most powerful message to share. And to also understand that, by the way, doing nothing is also a choice, and it's one that we should make very carefully, because it's also a choice that can degrade ecosystems. We are not absolved of responsibility simply because we don't pick up a chainsaw, right? We are responsible for them in this moment right now, whether we like it or not, and that carries with it whether we choose to take that responsibility and utilize it very actively or very passively.
And I think, I mean, it speaks to like the complexity of the situation too, right? And how there is no one size fits all approach. And have folks heard what's happened with the roadless rule in the last week, the rescinding of the roadless rule to allow building of roads through, so for example, to give the green light to the Ambler Road project in Alaska. That's going to cut through critical caribou migration corridor for energy development. Right? We know that our national forests are intended as multi-use. And so like speaking on BHA's behalf and our perspective on that, right, we're opposed to just a rescission of that rule, like blanket, right, and just opening up forests for the building of roads. There are certainly some areas where preservation is the best approach. That would be the best management approach, right? When we look at our forests here in Indiana, though, we might see something different, right? Different type of forest makeup than the Tongass, for example, right? What we see in the Hoosier as a forest that was cleared in the 19th century, right? Indiana was once 80% forested, and that was cleared by the turn of the century. And we've seen these efforts to rebuild our forests and to allow them to come back. And they've been in large part successful, right? I think it's an amazing thing, but management's necessary here, but there are definitely other places where, and so management's necessary here for the sake of wildlife as well as for the forest, right? For that natural community, where we see like out west, perhaps there are places where that's not the case, where that active management could in fact hinder wildlife.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Yes to everything they said. But what you said before has really resounded with me. We are nature's greatest threat, and we're its last best hope, I guess, right? Like, we are in a position now, we have put ourselves in a position where if we do nothing, we do bad, right? So we need to intervene. And it's this interesting situation where we're gonna pick winners and losers. That's the nature of this, right? I like ruffed grouse. I grew up in Pennsylvania. It was my state bird. I love ruffed grouse. They're all but extirpated from this state, and there's things we can do to slow their true extirpation and bring them back, and that's management, right? So there are things we have to do, but things will die in that process. Things will be removed from the equation in that process. And that's where we are. That's the reality. You're right. Like, there are still some places on Earth where true preservation is probably the best course. Unfortunately, Indiana is not that place, in my estimation. It has been so impacted that we're in this situation where we have to act.
Hi. Thanks for coming, you guys. This has been great. I'd like to follow up on the question of how do we know what trees used to be there, and also on Ethan's mention of native communities, which I hadn't heard of. So I'll tell you up front, I'm a misplaced Idahoan, which I was surprised BHA is in Indiana, but anyway. Yeah. So I'm from the West, and I have a Western mindset, and I'm a science geek, and I have a soils background. But it sounds like native communities are ecological sites. And ecological sites, and I've looked at some of them for Indiana. I'm more familiar with them in the West, but ecological sites tell you what trees were there. I I think ecological sites started in the West, because I know Joel Brown at NRCS was the instigator behind it. And the idea is they were based on range sites, which are based on soils. And we would make fun of, they were called habitat types in the West, because like it's a ponderosa pine forest. Well, it could be something else next week. But a Wyoming big sagebrush 12-inch precip zone is always a Wyoming sagebrush 12-inch precip zone, even if you mow all the sagebrush off. And so ecological sites have state and transition models. Do you use them in Indiana? Because I wrote up a thing, I'm a huge fan, if you can't tell. I wrote up a handout about it for the Purdue forest owners thing. And I'd be happy, I'd be happy to pass it on if you can put it in the newsletter. Do you guys use them? I mean, yes, I'm evangelizing ecological sites. There's a lot of ecological sites, if you want to know what used to be on your place. And in Indiana, they actually have diagrams for like where your soil is on the landscape, and they're based on, ecological sites are based on texture and position on the landscape. Yeah. Right, and they're one step beyond soils. They start with soils. Every soil is assigned an ecological site, but the soils don't have the state and transition models, and then how do you get from what you have now to what you want? You know, is it fire? Is it taking out the invasives? Anyway, ecological sites, I hope you use them.
It's difficult to know what Indiana exactly looked like because Indiana has been so altered over the years. The West is different. You know, the West had so much public land set aside early that there are vast areas that are still essentially what they were at one time. When Indiana became a state, actually when what we now know as the Northwest Territories, and that act was passed by Congress, one of the requirements of that was that the land would be surveyed by surveyors who would lay out a system of townships and ranges and section lines. And in their journals, they were required by law to write a couple of things. One was they had to record witness trees. So when they set a corner, they had to say, well, this corner was so far from a tree, and they would name the species of this size. And they would often along that section line describe the trees that they saw also. There were times when they didn't see trees even. They described grasslands or prairies or what they, in the southern part of the state, barrens is what they recorded. The purpose of that was that as settlers came to Indiana, they could read the surveyor's notes and decide for themselves, was that going to be good farmland or not, based on the trees that were growing there. But that gives us today, 200 years later, a record, a rough record, but it gives us a record of what the vegetation types were at that time. And there are a few little quirks about it that we have to be cautious, but it gives us some good information. Ethan mentioned that a natural community engages its processes too. And so we often see in their notes that they would record that there were areas with fire. There were very few people in Indiana at this time, and so the question is, why were we having fires out on the landscape? And a lot of this is thought to have been initially Native Americans were using fire to manage the land. And so to adequately, I think, go back to a template of what we need, we have to think about what does the land want and what does the land want to grow. We can look at those land surveyors' notes and we can try to bring those processes back. And our forest types are really disturbance dependent. They love disturbance and they thrive on disturbance. And as he mentioned, we think of, in our time and place, we think of our forests as being static. That is a myth. Our forests are dynamic and they're changing all the time. And we have to come to grips with that dynamism in a forest is an okay thing. It's okay for the forest to change, and it's okay for things to die, and it's okay for disturbance to happen, because that's what that forest wants. Anyone else?
I hadn't heard of that ecological sites thing. I'm going to look it up. Natural communities was the one I'll trade. I'll look up ecological sites. You look up natural communities, and then we'll trade.
Start with Web Soil Survey. There's going to be an article.
I use it all the time.
You said a few things that made me get up, but getting people more involved. So I'm a clinical herbalist, and I own the only herbal apothecary in the state of Indiana. And some of my friends are conservationists, and they had posted a whole list of like 6 different opportunistic plants, right? Invasives, I call them opportunistic. But I said, well, what are you guys gonna do with them? They said, well, we're trying so hard to get people to come out to our weed wrangle so we can get rid of them. And I was like, I sell and use every one of those in my apothecary, and I sell out of them, right? So what we started in some of the counties throughout Indiana is where herbalists and wild food foragers are teaming up with people like you. And so we have now had more people coming out than what they've ever expected. They have to cap it now. So they have to cap it because people are coming out, they're getting rid of the invasives, but they're also learning how to use the invasives for both wild food and medicinal purposes. So have you done that, or have you thought about doing that in your areas? Like garlic mustard, we weren't shoving it in plastic trash bags this year. We were teaching people how to eat it and how to use it for its medicinal purposes. I can't tell you how much Japanese barberry that I sell that I just dug up, right? Because it is highly invasive, right? But people are also buying it in a capsule called berberine, if you've heard of it, right? So it's people are making so much money off of isolating its alkaloids when we can use the whole plant and teach people how to do it because it's so simple. So I watched your YouTube video on that, and I was like, get out! I wish I was with him right now so that I could harvest all this with him, because it's such a medicinal plant with all the Berberis family plants, but that one is a stinker, so I get it. And then Japanese knotweed. I mean, I go through Japanese knotweed, like so much of it, to where I sell out of it and have to harvest it for the next year. So those were ideas of things that we have been seeing in our state, where you combine skilled, very trained herbalists with conservationists, and we've seen amazing results with that. So I wanted to know if you've done anything like that, or any of you.
Yeah, I have, and I think so with the medicinal and edible value of these plants. I think it is a beautiful thing, and I think it's wonderful. And then the nuance, of course, is like holding these two truths up at the same time, right? Which is that we can use this plant for this amazing thing, and also that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good thing to have everywhere.
Which is why you combine the two.
Right, and I think that one thing that I see a lot of is folks who are, have a big Japanese barberry problem across a huge acreage, for instance, or Japanese knotweed, and are like, well, I'm going to leave that right there in the woods because it's medicine, which is not what we want to do, right? So the nuance is, can we find a way to be like, when we're removing these plants, in certain situations, in certain places, let's get a bunch of people together, let's harvest a bunch of food and a bunch of medicine, and also understanding the circumstances where we do a different approach, and where that won't be enough to restore these ecosystems. But there's nothing wrong with finding value in these things. And if we can find value in these things and also like remove them, while also recognizing that, probably just doing that isn't gonna be enough to solve the problem everywhere, I think that's a beautiful thing.
That's where we need more awareness, where we can take conservationists with skilled herbalists and combine it, because then they're literally extracting them from the earth, from the roots, right? So I just think it's such a beautiful thing that we don't see enough of, because you're right. I teach plant walks all over the state of Indiana, and the invasives are insane. I can walk on every property and already know what I'm gonna find.
Right.
the
And,
invasives.
and yeah, and I think it's sort of like co-teaching also that there is something that we can use that also doesn't mean that it's good in every context, right? Which is a nuanced reality that's hard for us to sometimes express. And then I think the other thing that is important to acknowledge is that there will always be these plants on the landscape. We are not going to control them to death, nor are we really trying to. I think that if eradication is our goal of these plants, we will fail. And the goal is what we call control. Control is where we're doing our best to control these plants and to keep them from being a threat to our biodiversity, to our ecosystems, as best we can, right? And this will be a constant process. So even if we, don't worry, like even if we control these plants through every means that we have, we will still have these plants on our landscape as well. We're not going to eradicate them.
I think I outside of garlic mustard and watercress, I've thrown them all away. I didn't know these had any value, so this is great for me to know. But what I think I would say, I don't want to speak for you guys, but I'm relatively confident in this. All of us would rather something be utilized than thrown away, but we want to get it out, right? We want it out of the natural ecosystem we're trying to keep as natural as we can. But if someone's going to use it, that's a whole lot better than shoving it in a plastic trash bag and taking it to the incinerator.
I'd say another partner there too is the culinary community.
Yeah.
I know I've been at like wild game cook-offs where you would score extra points if you were using invasives because you're being incentivized to remove them, right? And so there's that too.
I think to add to what everybody's already said, I think that there's also a point that we have to remember that though these plants may have medicinal, are they adding to the community, the natural community itself? And that's, I think, one of the balancing points, and I've worked in forestry, I've also worked in row crop agriculture, and it's a conversation I've had with both sides of the coin. We have to feed America, but is a 100-acre field of corn adding to the ecological community? And being able to make that balance and understanding, okay, what impact are we trying to go after? Which one is the better gain? The gain of the natural community, the gain of the individual human's health, and how much do we need of each? And being able to keep that balance in check and focusing from the conservation aspect of keeping that, like Ethan said about the term control and not eradication. It'd be awesome if I could snap my fingers and all invasives would be eradicated and I would do it in a heartbeat. I'd snap here all night long. But that's not happening, and being able to focus on, the greater gain. And I'm going to take it back to earlier, there was a comment made about, using herbicide, and it's a conversation I've had with hundreds of people. I had a conversation with a landowner not too long ago where she asked me, she said, hey, my husband really likes using herbicide on these invasives. I don't like it. Can you explain to me if it's good or not? We had about a 20-minute conversation, and she then ended it with, well, I think I'm just going to tell him that he can spray whenever I go shopping. And I had to laugh because she's like, I understand the greater good. I just can't bring my personal ethics to be okay with it. And I think that's where, we have to be willing to agree with the greater good, but remember of where our ethics are personally and what we can forego and what we have to be able to turn a kind of a blind eye per se to. So, but yeah, that balancing of all the ecosystems and all the parts involved in that ecosystem. So,
Assume good intent. Like all of us are trying to do good by our natural communities here. We may have different mechanisms. Assume good intent and let people get to where they get to.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you for that thought-provoking question, and thank you to the panelists. This concludes our panel discussion time, and we'll transition on to the next phase. Was that you, JD? All right. Well, thank you all so much.
I'm Judy Brown, coordinator for the Let the Sunshine In program in Indiana. And on behalf of all of our sponsors. We wanted to, we want to thank our sponsors again for making this evening possible. We want to thank our panelists. We want to thank Ethan for joining us this evening. We also like to thank all of you for coming out this evening and enjoying this really thought-provoking conversation. We do have a couple of door prizes. We have 2 of Ethan's books that we'd like to give away, and we do have some empty seats. And so what I will ask is for Ethan to pick a number between 1 and 126. Just randomly pick one.
3.
Okay. So number 3 is Danielle Archer. And is Danielle here? All right. You want to pick another one?
94.
94. It's Brian Burr. Is Brian here? Yep. All right. All right. Once again, we wanted to thank everyone for coming. And Ethan has signed those books, by the way, the ones that we just gave
I
out.
was gonna say, if not, I know where you can.
If you do have books that you would like for Ethan to sign, there's the room around the corner. If you want to bring your books, and Ethan will be there at a table and will sign the books. And again, if you want to just come over, we also have a lot of the sponsors have tables, so you can come and check out the tables, chat with Ethan a little bit before you head home. Again, thank you all for coming, and have a safe journey home.